The night before his surgery, my husband said, "Don't give him a dime without proof." The sterile smell of disinfectant filled the preoperative room at Jackson Memorial Hospital as I held my husband Robert's weathered hand, watching him struggle to find the right words for what might be our final conversation. After 38 years of marriage to a Miami police sergeant, I had learned to read the worry lines on his face, but tonight those familiar creases held a different kind of concern as he prepared for the risky heart surgery that would either save his life or take him from me forever. Robert's voice was barely a whisper when he squeezed my fingers and said the words that would haunt me for months to come. "Linda, if something happens to me tomorrow, promise me you won't give Danny a single dime without absolute proof that he's really changed." The bitterness in his tone cut through my heart like a knife, because we both knew our 32-year-old son had broken every promise he'd ever made about getting clean from the drug addiction that had consumed the last 15 years of his life. If this story is touching your heart, please comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel because we truly help families going through difficult situations like this one. Your support helps us continue sharing these stories of overcoming adversity and family healing. Danny had been such a bright child, graduating valedictorian from his high school in Coral Gables and earning a full scholarship to the University of Miami, where he studied pre-law with dreams of following his father's path in public service. But somewhere during his junior year, prescription painkillers prescribed after a football injury had opened the door to a nightmare that would destroy not only his promising future but tear our family apart piece by piece over the next decade and a half. The transformation had been gradual at first, missed classes explained away as stress, weight loss attributed to the demands of his studies, but by his senior year the truth became impossible to ignore. Danny was stealing from our wallets, pawning family heirlooms, and disappearing for days at a time, returning home with hollow eyes and elaborate stories that grew more desperate and unbelievable with each telling. Robert, with his law enforcement experience, had recognized the signs long before I was willing to admit our perfect son had become someone we barely recognized. The man who had spent his career arresting drug dealers and seeing the devastation addiction brought to families was now watching it destroy his own home, powerless to save the child he had raised with such hope and dedication. We had tried everything over the years. Multiple rehabilitation programs that cost us our retirement savings, interventions with professional counselors, tough love approaches that left us sleepless with worry, and enabling behaviors that only seemed to make the problem worse. Each attempt at recovery brought renewed hope followed by devastating relapses that left emotional scars on our hearts and drained our financial resources. The night before Robert's surgery, as we sat in that hospital room surrounded by the beeping of monitors and the clinical atmosphere of impending medical procedures, he made me promise something that went against every maternal instinct in my body. He wanted me to refuse any requests for money from Danny unless our son could provide concrete evidence of sustained sobriety, steady employment, and genuine commitment to rebuilding his life. Robert survived the surgery, but the recovery was slower and more complicated than we had expected. During the 3 months he spent moving between the hospital and rehabilitation facilities, Danny appeared at our door multiple times with increasingly desperate pleas for financial help, each story more elaborate than the last. Job opportunities that required upfront investment, apartment deposits for transitional housing, medical bills from emergency room visits that may or may not have actually occurred. Following Robert's instructions felt like betraying my son, but I had learned to recognize the manipulation tactics that addiction had taught Danny to use against the people who loved him most. Each time I said no, I watched his face cycle through anger, pleading, guilt trips, and finally that cold detachment that had become his default expression when family members refused to enable his destructive choices. The breaking point came 4 months after Robert's surgery, when Danny arrived at our house in Kendall with a black eye and a story about being beaten up for money he allegedly owed to dangerous people. He begged for $3,000, claiming his life was in danger and that we were his only hope for survival. The terror in his eyes seemed genuine, but Robert and I had heard similar stories too many times to trust them without verification. Instead of giving him money, I offered to drive him to the police station to file a report about the alleged attack, or to a hospital if he needed medical attention for his injuries. Danny's reaction to these offers revealed the truth. His anger and immediate departure made it clear that his story had been fabricated to manipulate our parental fears into opening our wallets once again. That night, as Robert and I sat in our living room processing the latest encounter with our son's addiction, We made a decision that would define the next phase of our relationship with Danny. We would continue to offer love, emotional support, and practical help that didn't involve money, but we would no longer participate in funding the lifestyle that was slowly killing the child we had raised with such hopes and dreams. The decision brought an unexpected peace to our household, even though it meant accepting that Danny might choose his addiction over his family relationships. After years of walking on eggshells, wondering when the next crisis would arrive, and constantly worrying about whether our help was actually making things worse, we finally had clear boundaries that protected both our financial security and our emotional well-being. During the following months, Danny's visits became less frequent and more hostile. He accused us of being heartless parents who had abandoned their child in his greatest time of need, conveniently ignoring the hundreds of thousands of dollars we had already spent on rehabilitation programs, legal fees, and emergency interventions over the previous 15 years. The guilt was overwhelming at times, especially during the quiet moments when I would remember the little boy who used to help me bake cookies for his father's police colleagues, or the teenager who had worked summers at the community center teaching younger kids to read. But Robert reminded me regularly that the son we remembered was still somewhere inside the person Danny had become, and that enabling his addiction was not the way to bring that person back to the surface. 8 months after Robert's surgery, we received a phone call that changed everything. Danny was in jail, arrested for possession with intent to distribute, facing serious federal charges that could result in decades in prison. The lawyer he needed would cost more than our house was worth, and the bail amount was far beyond our financial capabilities even if we had been willing to mortgage our future for another attempt at rescue. This time, instead of scrambling to find money for lawyers and bail, we made a different choice. We visited Danny in jail to offer our emotional support and to help him understand the legal process he was facing, but we made it clear that we would not be funding his defense or working to secure his release. He would need to face the consequences of his choices with the support of a public defender and the jail's rehabilitation programs. Danny's reaction was explosive anger followed by weeks of refusing our visits or phone calls. Other family members criticized our decision, arguing that we were abandoning our son when he needed us most. But Robert and I had finally learned the difference between helping someone and enabling their self-destruction, a lesson that had taken us nearly 2 decades of pain and financial devastation to fully understand. The months Danny spent in county jail waiting for his trial became an unexpected period of clarity for our family. Without the constant chaos of addiction-driven crises, Robert and I were able to focus on rebuilding our own relationship and addressing the trauma that years of dealing with Danny's problems had inflicted on our marriage and our individual mental health. We started attending support groups for families of addicted individuals, where we learned that our experience was far from unique and that many parents had gone through similar struggles with adult children whose addiction had consumed entire family systems. These groups provided both practical advice and emotional validation that helped us process the guilt and grief we had been carrying for so many years. During this period, we also began receiving letters from Danny that were different in tone from any communication we had received from him in years. Without access to drugs and with the structure of jail routine, he began expressing genuine remorse for the pain he had caused our family and showing signs of the analytical thinking that had made him such a promising student before addiction took over his life. The letters weren't manipulative requests for money or rescue, but rather honest reflections on the choices he had made and the relationships he had damaged. He wrote about his memories of childhood, his gratitude for the sacrifices Robert and I had made for his education, and his growing understanding of how his addiction had affected everyone who loved him. 6 months into his incarceration, Danny was accepted into the jail's intensive substance abuse program, a rigorous 6-month course that combined group therapy, individual counseling, job training, and educational components designed to address both the addiction itself and the life skills necessary for successful reintegration into society. For the first time in over a decade, Danny was required to maintain sobriety for an extended period while participating in meaningful activities and taking responsibility for his daily choices. The program demanded accountability in ways that our well-intentioned family interventions had never been able to achieve, providing the external structure that Danny needed to begin addressing his addiction seriously. His letters during this period showed a gradual transformation in his thinking and his relationship with himself. He wrote about discovering that he had been using drugs not just to get high, but to avoid dealing with feelings of inadequacy and fear that had developed during his college years when the pressure to succeed had become overwhelming. The trial resulted in a plea agreement that required Danny to complete the jail's substance abuse program and spend an additional 18 months in a court-supervised halfway house with strict requirements for drug testing, employment, and continued counseling. While the sentence meant more time away from home, it also provided the long-term support structure that previous rehabilitation attempts had lacked. During his time in the halfway house, Danny began reaching out to us with regular phone calls that focused on rebuilding our relationship rather than requesting financial assistance. These conversations were initially awkward and tentative, but gradually became more natural as we all learned to communicate without the underlying tension of addiction-driven manipulation. Robert's recovery from heart surgery had been successful, but the experience had given him a new perspective on the importance of relationships and the value of time spent with people we love. He began visiting Danny at the halfway house, initially skeptical but gradually recognizing genuine changes in our son's attitude and behavior. The visits became opportunities for honest conversations about the pain that addiction had caused our family, the mistakes that had been made on all sides, and the possibility of rebuilding trust through consistent actions over time. Danny acknowledged the financial devastation his addiction had caused and committed to making amends through his actions rather than his words. 12 months into his halfway house residency, Danny secured full-time employment as a maintenance worker for the Miami-Dade County Parks Department, a job that provided both steady income and the satisfaction of contributing to his community. The work was physically demanding but allowed him to be outdoors and away from the high-stress environments that had previously triggered his drug use. His supervisor, unaware of Danny's criminal history, praised his reliability and work ethic in ways that reminded Robert and me of the responsible young man our son had been before addiction took over his life. These small victories felt significant because they represented genuine achievements rather than the empty promises that had characterized his previous attempts at recovery. Danny also began attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings regularly, not because they were required by his legal supervision, but because he had found value in the community of people who understood his struggles and could provide ongoing support for his recovery. He started sponsoring newer members, which gave him purpose and helped reinforce his own commitment to sobriety. As his court-supervised residency neared its end, Danny approached us with a detailed plan for his transition to independent living. Instead of asking for money, he presented a budget based on his actual income, a modest apartment he had found within his means, and a timeline for gradually rebuilding the trust and relationship that addiction had nearly destroyed. The conversation was different from any we had shared in over 15 years. Danny spoke with clarity about his limitations, his ongoing need for support systems, and his understanding that rebuilding our family relationship would require consistent actions over years, not dramatic gestures or promises that might not be sustainable under pressure. Robert and I agreed to provide emotional support and practical assistance that didn't involve direct financial help, driving him to appointments when needed, helping him move his few possessions to his new apartment, and being available for regular phone calls and visits as he navigated the challenges of early recovery in the community. 2 years after Robert's heart surgery, our family celebrated a milestone that once seemed impossible: Danny's second anniversary of continuous sobriety. The celebration was quiet and private, held in our backyard with homemade food and the presence of a few close friends who had supported our family through the worst years of addiction and recovery. Danny spoke briefly about his gratitude for the people who had refused to enable his addiction, including parents who had learned to say no when saying yes would have been easier and more comfortable. He acknowledged that our decision to stop providing money had initially felt like abandonment but had ultimately been the catalyst that forced him to take responsibility for his own recovery. Today, 4 years after that night in the hospital when Robert made me promise to demand proof before giving Danny any financial assistance, our son has maintained his sobriety, advanced to a supervisory position with the county, and begun taking night classes toward completing his college degree. The relationship we thought we had lost forever has been rebuilt on a foundation of honesty, accountability, and mutual respect. The journey taught us that sometimes the most loving thing parents can do for an adult child is to refuse to rescue them from the consequences of their choices. Robert's wisdom about demanding proof rather than accepting promises had seemed harsh at the time, but it had provided the boundary that allowed our son to find his own strength and motivation for recovery. Our family's story is one of second chances earned through hard work rather than given through enabling, and of love that was strong enough to risk rejection in order to provide the tough love that addiction recovery sometimes requires. The promise Robert made me make in that hospital room had saved not only our financial future but ultimately our son's life as well. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to comment below and let us know where you are watching from, as well as your thoughts on family dynamics like this. Every perspective matters, because stories like these remind us that while families may face struggles, challenges, and even heartbreak, there is always an opportunity for healing, connection, and growth. By sharing your own reflections, you not only add to the conversation but also create a ripple effect of encouragement for others who may be experiencing something similar. When you engage, whether it's through commenting, liking, or subscribing, you are helping us build a space where families can feel less alone and more supported. Many people silently carry burdens within their homes, and often just hearing that someone else understands can provide an enormous sense of relief and hope. This channel is more than a platform for stories. It's a community where resilience, compassion, and solidarity take center stage. Your support allows us to continue creating and sharing content that uplifts, inspires, and shines a light on the very real challenges that families go through. We believe that even in the most difficult circumstances, there are lessons to be learned and strength to be found, and together, by engaging with these stories, we can remind one another that no family has to navigate their journey in isolation. So please, if this message resonates with you, don't hesitate to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you're not just supporting us, you're standing with countless families around the world who find courage and comfort in knowing that they are part of a wider circle of understanding and care. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for helping us continue to share these powerful stories of resilience and hope.